Good evening. Good evening. I'm going to ask my wife to sit down so we can get started. You too, Michelle. Payback. And Janine. Well, Alex Burden, Executive Director of the Truman Library Institute. Welcome to the first event that we've done at the Truman Forum since October of 2019, which seems like, thank you. That was 2.5 years ago, I think, if you do the math right, but it seems like it was a lot longer ago than that. It's great to be here. It's great to see many of you who I haven't seen in 2.5 years or longer. So Paul, Larry, so many others work in the room. It kind of brings back memories of more than 60 or 70 events that we've done in this Truman Forum, mostly with our partners, the Kansas City Public Library. You probably remember some of those great moments, Hail to the Chiefs, Beyond the Gowns. So we're back in business. The Truman exhibit, you've probably seen that 65 times. We need to refresh that, but it's nice to be with you here tonight. We're going to have a great program with Mark UPDEGROVE. I also want to say hello and welcome to the audience that we have that are tuned in live streamed, including my parents from Grand Lake, Oklahoma, Mom and Dad. Hi there. But obviously, like a whole new wrinkle of our programming is our live streamed audience. We had 400 people that had signed up to watch this remotely from their living rooms and their sofas, which is obviously one of the good benefits of being locked away from one another for the last 2.5 years. There was another event that some of you may remember that we did 10 months ago in December of 2018. It was another wonderful Truman community event. It featured Clifton Truman Daniel, the president's grandson, Lucy Baines Johnson, and our friend Mark UPDEGROVE, who was the star of tonight's show. And they had a really fascinating discussion about LBJ and Harry Truman. Tonight, it's not Truman, it's not LBJ, it's John F. Kennedy. We're really thrilled to have Mark with us in person again tonight, talking about his new book, JFK, Incomparable Grace, which is a really fascinating study about the Kennedy presidency, receiving universal praise. I looked this up, so I know what I'm talking about, from readers, pundits, and pretty much every presidential historian in the presidential historian industry has praised this book and thought it's fantastic. So we're in for a real treat tonight. And by the way, speaking of the books, on your way out, you'll see a table with piles of the books. Please feel free to grab one. They are signed with a book plate from Mark, and that's an expression of our gratitude to you for your interest in presidential history and Truman. Before I introduce tonight's guest, no, thank you. For those of you who remember me at this podium in previous iterations, I do plug Harry Truman and the Truman Library, so it might be a good time for you to go to the bathroom or get another glass of wine. But I'll start with a question for all of you. How many of you know that we just invested $30 million in the Truman Library and Independence? All right, that's great. Now, how many of you have actually visited the Truman Library to see what we've done? All right, I saw a few hands that were up earlier that didn't come up this time, so come on out. It's not that far away. We'd love to have you. We have fully reopened 7 days a week, Monday through Sunday, great hours, great access. I was out on Monday. I was out on Tuesday last week for tours. The crowds are back. The excitement is palpable, and it's really an incredible thing that we've done. We have members' nights coming up, and I did say nights, not nights, 2 different nights, June 15th and June 16th. We usually do one, but our first one sold out so quickly when we released our invitation that we decided we should probably do another one, or we'd have about 1,000 people in the Truman Library at the same time. So I encourage you, if you're a member, to join us. You can sign up on our website. If you're not a member, I encourage you to be a member and to join us. You can sign up on our website. It'll be a really special opportunity. I'll be there. Kurt Graham will be there. Truman Library Institute staff will be there to help host you. It's a private function. The library's closed. Great food and drink. So I also want to get to the program because that's why you're here tonight. Thanks for joining us, and thank you. It's going to be a really fascinating presentation about Kennedy. We are in for a real treat. I've known Mark since 2009, which was a long time ago. He told me tonight I had more hair when we first met, and the last time we met I had my beard in action, which was very furry and helped balance things out. But I consider Mark to be the creme de la creme of the presidential library system. He's simply a fantastic historian, public speaker, great representative of the LBJ legacy. He is currently the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. He also is serving as the presidential historian for ABC News. From 2009 to 2017, he was the director of the LBJ Library. So he served in Kurt's role, Kurt Graham, the director of the library, for about 9 years, and then had a hiatus, and then came back as the CEO of the foundation and continues his great work for the LBJ Library and Legacy. He's written 5 books, including the one that you're going to hear about tonight. He's the executive producer of the recent CNN series, LBJ, Triumph and Tragedy. He has written for a whole lot of publications, including New York Times, Politico, Time, National Geographic, Daily Beast, and the USA Today. And this is the thing that really, being in this industry as long as I have for 15 years, that really stands out to me. He's had the unique and rare opportunity to have exclusive, lengthy interviews with 7 different presidents, which is just simply fantastic. Mark will be discussing his book, Conversation Style, with our own Kurt Graham, director of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum. Kurt has served as the director. Does anybody want to applause Kurt? I think Kurt has some shills in the audience. There's a contingent of his family, so you guys need to step up your applause for Kurt when he comes out. But he's been with us for 7 years, almost 7 years, and it's been, what did I write? A wild, fun, and successful ride, maybe a little hectic, definitely very busy. And what we've accomplished during Kurt's tenure calls to mind, in fact, a very appropriate and relevant Truman quote: "Being a president is like riding a tiger. A man has to keep on riding or be swallowed." So fortunately, we weren't swallowed, and we kept on riding until we crossed the finish line. And Kurt's exemplary leadership of the library was of huge help to the Institute as we successfully accomplished the most important and meaningful goal and project in the Truman Library's history, the $30 million renovation, which keeps going, by the way. We've got another $14 million we're going to be spending on the exterior grounds. Our total campaign is now $55 million. For those of you who are involved as board leaders and donors, thank you very much. It was a really incredible and successful project. This is my last plug. That's 25 minutes away, Independence, Missouri, northeast of here. Come on out. We're waiting for you. You'll have a really incredible experience in the new Truman. So with that said, I'm done plugging the library, introducing the guests. Please join me in welcoming Mark UPDEGROVE and Kurt Graham to the stage.
Alex. Well, thank you, Alex. That was very kind. I was just a little confused. I wasn't sure. Am I the president or the tiger? I wasn't sure how that worked out. But it's been great to be partnered with you all these years, and very, very pleased with what's been accomplished at the Truman Library and across the library system. I'm just a huge fan of what these libraries do. And as Alex mentioned, Mark has been on both sides of this. He's been in the director role of the library and now the director of the foundation, and has just done some incredible work all around. Welcome to Kansas City, my friend.
Well, I'm assuming that rousing ovation was for Kurt, not for me. I'll have to earn my applause later.
Well, we'll start earning it now. I'm going to let me do the commercial first. You're all going to get a copy of Incomparable Grace. Yes. And and honestly, it is an incomparable achievement. This is really an incredible book, and I think that you're going to enjoy not only the conversation, but I think you're going to enjoy having a copy of this. It's really, really quite an achievement when you think about being able to tell a story and have a narrative carry you through, but also have all the insight and analysis that someone as nuanced as Mark brings to it. So anyway, you can look forward to reading it if you haven't already. Mark, I want to start by talking about how you got here writing a book like this. I mean, with your connections and your profile and the kinds of work you've done, you could have written about any modern president, well, any president for that matter, but certainly in the modern era, you had your pick of subjects. Why Kennedy? Why now?
Well, first of all, thank you to Alex and Kurt for having me tonight. I have enormous respect. We'll talk tonight about our 35th president, but I have enormous respect for our 33rd president, and am in awe of what Alex and Kurt have done with the Truman Library. The Truman Library is a national treasure, and it was in need of refreshing, and the vision that you both had for what the Truman Library should become as you look forward has been realized with your enormous efforts. I have not seen it myself. I've seen it online, but I haven't seen it, and look forward to doing so tomorrow. So thank you for having me, and congratulations on the formidable accomplishment that you have achieved. Yes. Again, applause for them and not for me.
He's beyond that now. He's just so, he's so fat.
So why did I write about the 35th president? I have spent, as Alex suggested, 13 years around our 36th president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Some as director and now as the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. And it's funny because you almost have to pick a lane. Because there was this ambiguous relationship between the Kennedys and Johnson. There were different Kennedys and they had different relationships to Lyndon Johnson. There is the thought that you had to pick a lane. You were either a Kennedy person or a Johnson person. And we see those legacies almost at odds with one another. We imagine what Kennedy would have done that Lyndon Johnson didn't do. He would have pulled troops from Vietnam, and we think that Kennedy would have done it right and Johnson did it wrong, or vice versa. But in fact, they have very complementary legacies. John F. Kennedy creates this high tide of liberalism. He gets us believing in ourselves, and we'll certainly talk about the hope and optimism that he brought to his presidency. We all remember his indelible inauguration speech in those immortal words, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And that becomes this eternal expression of American ideals, reaching for something beyond ourselves and doing something for the country that we love. And we believe in Kennedy, and as a consequence, we believe in government. So when he is assassinated the following year, our faith in government at 77% is at an all-time high. Let me put that in perspective. Today, it's in the 20% range. So we believe in what America can do, and Johnson seizes on that. There was a woman named Liz Carpenter who worked for Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, and she once encapsulated the legacies of Johnson and Kennedy pretty well. She said, JFK inspired, which LBJ was incapable of doing, and Johnson delivered. And so when Kennedy inspires us to be better and Johnson takes the presidency, he does. He puts into action legislation that creates the foundation for modern America. He capitalizes on this faith in government and the majorities that he has in the House and Senate, and gives us civil rights and federal aid to education and environmental reform and Medicare and Medicaid and on and on and on. So they're highly complementary legacies, and I wanted to understand John F. Kennedy a little bit better, and this book was a means of doing that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense, because when you think about how different they are, those legacies, the sort of the Harvards, as LBJ called them, versus the, Johnson was always very self-conscious about his educational background and kind of where he came from and how he got there. And they were so, you write about how surprised the Kennedy clan, all of them were, that Lyndon Johnson accepted the invitation to be on the ticket.
Yeah, and you described, what you described about Lyndon Johnson, that's Harry Truman too.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
They're so similar in so many respects. And LBJ had enormous respect for Harry Truman, so much so, as you know, Kurt, that when Medicare and Medicaid were signed into law, Lyndon Johnson comes to Independence, Missouri, and goes to the Truman Library.
On the stage in our auditorium.
Exactly.
Signs the bill.
And he gives Medicare cards number 1 and 2 to Harry and Bess Truman, respectively, and calls Harry Truman, and rightfully so in many respects, the daddy, the true daddy of Medicare, because he had tried to get it done during his time. But you're right, the Kennedys think about who they're going to put on the ticket in 1960. And Lyndon Johnson is certainly at the top of that list. There is some ambivalence on, more than ambivalence on Bobby Kennedy.
Right.
So I mentioned that we tend to conflate the Kennedys. There is not one Kennedy view of Lyndon Johnson. There are many. The Kennedy patriarch, Joe Kennedy, has enormous respect for Lyndon Johnson. And in fact, when there's the possibility that John F. Kennedy will vie for the vice presidential nomination in 1956, his father advises him, don't do it unless Lyndon is at the head of the ticket. And if that's the case, I'll finance the campaign.
Yeah.
So when 1960 comes along, the Kennedy patriarch is very much in favor of Johnson being on the ticket. Bobby Kennedy, on the other hand, despises Kennedy, and that contempt is mutual. John F. Kennedy is somewhere in between, but he realizes when he was a backbencher in the U.S. Senate prior to becoming the Democratic presidential nominee, whenever he had something that he needed to get done, he had to go through this behemoth, the all-powerful Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson. He knew that Johnson understood power. He knew that Johnson would be a good successor if something were to happen to him. Moreover, it was a political decision. John F. Kennedy was looked upon as a northern liberal, distrusted in many respects by those in the South at a time when there was a tenuous relationship between Southerners and the Democratic Party. So Lyndon Johnson gave the ticket Southern balance and a Boston-Austin kind of northern-southern balance that I think was the cause of John F. Kennedy winning the presidency. Without that balance, it wouldn't have happened. But even when he did win the presidency, it was by a mere 118,000 votes, 0.2 of a percentage point, get John F. Kennedy to the White House. Think about that is a real squeaker. We think of John F. Kennedy today as one of the great or near great presidents, but he wins in a whisper in 1960.
Amazing. And wasn't it true that in the prior elections that the margins in Texas for the Democrats were really shrinking? So having Johnson on the ticket really did make a difference, or they perceived anyway that
There's
that would
no question about
make a big difference. When you mentioned the difference between Kennedy and Johnson in terms of one being sort of a visionary and the other being an implementer, it reminds me of a quote someone said about Harry Truman when FDR died, that Roosevelt was a great architect, perhaps Truman will be a good carpenter. And that was the kind of view, that maybe he can carry out this plan and put it together.
Might be oversimplification, but you have the show ponies and you have the race horse, the plow horses, right?
Yeah, right.
And in so many respects, Truman and Johnson are doers.
Right, absolutely. And I think I wanted to ask you about that more around Johnson and Kennedy, because their legislative legacies are very different. And first of all, their experience. I mean, you say pretty bluntly, pretty frankly, that Kennedy's was pretty undistinguished as both a member of the House and even in the Senate. He just really almost didn't seem that interested, if I read you correctly, not that interested in legislation. He had bigger goals, larger ambitions, and I wonder how important was that in terms of what he was able to accomplish? Because it doesn't seem to me that he ever really understood the legislative process, which, of course, Lyndon Johnson was the legislative process. I mean, so how did that make a difference for both of their legacies?
In some ways, we get so lucky, and if you look at American history, we are so lucky at certain times to have the right man in place or the right woman in place at the right time. Harry Truman is a great example of that. Mm-hmm. Think about what would have happened if Henry Wallace had been the vice president to take over upon the death of
Couldn't raise
Franklin
$50 million
Roosevelt.
for Henry Wallace, I don't think, Alex.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
But it didn't necessarily have to be Harry Truman, but Harry Truman was the perfect person to succeed Franklin Roosevelt. In many respects, Gerald Ford was the perfect person to succeed Richard Nixon. But when Kennedy's president, the dominant issue is the Cold War, without question.
Yeah.
Right? That defines geopolitics at that time, and we're divided into East and West. Cold War tensions are at an all-time high. And that starts to cool down after the successful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't go necessarily into a period of detente, but the Russians are far less aggressive than they had been. So it becomes less important for Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson can focus on domestic policy. By the way, domestic policy didn't interest John F. Kennedy much. He wanted to be a great president, without question. He wanted to be a president along the lines of a Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to stand on the world stage in the manner that Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle did. He wanted greatness. But he believed that greatness would come from foreign policy. You had to be a great foreign policy president if you were to achieve greatness. Lyndon Johnson didn't much care about international politics. He cared about domestic politics, and he cared about getting legislation through. And he, to some degree, to a large extent, he exploits the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy to get the Civil Rights of 1964 passed. He implores reluctant lawmakers to do what their slain president would have wanted them to do, and that gets through the civil rights. It wouldn't likely have happened if John F. Kennedy had continued as president. In fact, it was languishing in the halls of Congress when he was assassinated in November of 1963. But Johnson goes far further, and with the Great Society, again, as I mentioned, builds the foundation for modern America in all that he achieves. I used to, as you know, Kurt, in my old office when I was the director of the LBJ library, I had a shadow box containing the pens that LBJ used to sign landmark bills into law in 1 year of his presidency, 1965, which was the height of his presidency after he was elected in his own right. And in that case, you had the pens that signed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Highway Education Act, the creation of Medicare, Medicaid, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Head Start, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Highway Beautification Act, the Immigration Act, the most sweeping immigration reform in the history of our country, and the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah. Incredible.
Again, the applause for Lyndon Johnson.
Yes.
And I used to look at that and think, what the hell have you done today?
Yeah.
But that is just an astounding achievement, and I think that comes because Johnson, although Vietnam is very much coming to dominate his presidency, that comes because the Cold War has gotten a little less cold.
Right.
At that
But do you
moment.
think that has to do with the difference between, Kennedy's lack of interest in domestic politics and Lyndon just kind of picks that up, or is it just, is it a will thing, or is it just the fact that he just wasn't into legislation and Johnson was the master of it, and so he just sort of took the reins and was able to do it? Would those things have been able to pass under Kennedy? Would he have had the will and the knowledge to do that?
Probably not, because a lot of these things are picked up by Lyndon Johnson
Right.
and made bigger by Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson saw his first year and 2 months in the presidency as finishing the work of John F. Kennedy, among them putting into place the Civil Rights Act, also a tax cut in order to get the economy moving again. But when he becomes president in his own right, he is not looking at Kennedy's legislative agenda. He's looking at the unfinished business of Franklin Roosevelt. He wants to complete the New Deal, and to a large extent, the Fair Deal of Truman. He wants to do what they couldn't have done. Roosevelt didn't touch civil rights because that was the third rail at the time.
Right.
He couldn't alienate Southern Democrats who were helping to get his New Deal legislation through Congress. Lyndon Johnson realizes that because of the movement, the success of the civil rights movement, and I think we'll talk about that as far as Kennedy goes, it creates this awareness among Americans that something needs to be done. And Lyndon Johnson, being the master politician that he was, exploits that at every turn. So I think that the timing was right, too, for Lyndon Johnson in some respects. That said, if he had been elected in 1960, I think he would have seen far greater legislative achievement. I don't know what would have happened in the Bay of Pigs. I don't know what would have happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I think it goes without saying that there would have been far more laws pushed through by Lyndon Johnson.
It is interesting that you say that Kennedy sort of had his sights set on international politics and the global order, whatever you want to call it. And because you often think of presidents being thrust into foreign policy circumstances that they didn't choose, and they have to deal with them. They don't choose that as a path. It's just they have an agenda, and all of a sudden a war breaks out somewhere or something, and they have to confront it. So it's interesting to think that that's what Kennedy wanted. He wanted the international stuff more so than the domestic.
But Kurt, it's foreshadowed in that iconic inauguration speech. In addition to the ask not ethos that he reflects in that speech, you get the pay any price, bear any burden.
Yeah.
It's mostly Cold War bravado. It's mostly talking about our need to stand up to communist aggression. That's what the speech is principally about. And so it's not a great surprise that that's what he aims for. He also likely wins the presidency by creating the myth that there is this missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Much to Eisenhower's chagrin.
Much to Eisenhower's chagrin. He sort of suggests that Eisenhower is asleep at the wheel, and while he's kind of docile in the presidency, the Soviet Union is ramping up their nuclear weapons program. In fact, we had a 9-to-1 advantage on nuclear weaponry. So it's absolutely erroneous, but it's a good political tactic.
Sure.
It's a very effective political
And you
tactic.
wouldn't want to let the truth get in the way of a campaign. I mean, there's an opportunity to do things. The, you know, when you mentioned, I just wanted to plug this point because, you know, Marcus mentioned all of this incredible legislative accomplishment that LBJ rightfully, you know, deserves credit for. But what's interesting to me, and you shared this with us, Mark, in these great taped conversations from LBJ, you know, from the White House. He had the tape machine going all the time, and I think he's the one that told Richard Nixon, there's this great technology you can use. It's really helpful. But there's a tape, there's a conversation on Christmas morning, 1968, when LBJ is, you know, he's leaving office in January, so he's just kind of having his last Christmas as president, and he calls Harry and Bess Truman at their home in Independence on Delaware Street. And he's talking to them, wishing them a Merry Christmas, and he makes a comment to Bess. He said his staff had just given him a plaque listing all of the accomplishments of his administration, and much like the pens that he's talking about, all of these great pieces of legislation. He said they've just lined it out, and he said, you know what, Bess? I looked down that list, and I realized that about half of those things started with Harry. And I thought it was so, first of all, generous, but and that he had that context. And I think as a legislator, that's what I keep going back to. I think that because he understood that process, he recognized that you don't just do that by yourself. Maybe as a president, you act by yourself, but as a legislator, you have to have some consensus and have to have people around you. And I think he, you know, gave credit to Truman for so much of what he accomplished. And I've always really appreciated that about LBJ, that he really admired Harry Truman for what he accomplished.
And there's a lesson in that for leadership. Give credit away.
Yeah.
Now it's ironic because, in my opinion, Lyndon Johnson does not get the credit he deserves. That's part of the reason I wanted to go to the LBJ Presidential Library. I wanted to see LBJ's rightful place in history. It took a while for Harry Truman, but it came around to Truman in a big way. And I still don't think it has fully come to Lyndon Johnson. But part of it was his own doing, giving credit away, signing Medicare here and calling Truman the real daddy of that legislation. Well, it took real legislative will and strength to push that through Congress. It was enormously difficult, but he gave the credit away. When he signed the Civil Rights Act, he gave that first pen to Everett Dirksen, the Republican minority leader in the Senate, without whom you wouldn't have had civil rights because Southern Democrats were standing in the way of it. So he always gave credit away, and that's to some degree hurts him in history.
Yeah. Case in point, that's why we have the Marshall Plan and not the Truman Plan.
That's right. That's right. Harry Truman did the exact same thing.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about their style. I thought you really brought some interesting things to the fore about the way they do their business and the way, Kennedy in particular. And I noted a couple things. You know, he really preferred small meetings. You know, he did not like having a bunch of people in a room. For him, the meeting was better if there were fewer people, and that's how he liked to see it. He had what we have come to speak about today as unstructured executive time. A lot of that, it seemed, and you even allude to the fact that his staff couldn't really get him to focus a lot. And I don't know, is that part of why he wasn't into legislation? I mean, I'm just kind of curious because when you think of Kennedy, you think of all these sort of great things that happen, but what's going on behind the scenes that's allowing him to sort of make decisions? How is he functioning if he's not really paying attention and the staff are having a hard time getting him to read, you know, policy papers and different things they're presenting him?
There's this wonderful story in the first couple weeks of his administration. There is a ceremony in the Oval Office to honor the outgoing Secretary General of the United Nations, Paul-Henri Spaak. And the White House staff wants him to rehearse the ceremony and show him, take him exactly through the moves, as we all do when you go on stage. There's a rehearsal period, right? So we know where we're going and we know what we're doing.
We were here all afternoon.
Right.
Just that walkout was, I mean, it was...
And I'm still in the wrong chair.
Yeah,
but
that's
anyway,
right. You got to roll with it. You got to go.
But Kennedy, being impatient and to some degree impetuous, doesn't want to rehearse. He just wants to wing it. So he goes into the Oval Office. There's this, makes a few remarks. There's this flurry of handshakes, and he darts out one of the doors. Doesn't know which door, but just walks out. And then instinctively he walks into, opens another door and walks into that room. only to find himself in a bathroom where he had to stay in private embarrassment until the people cleared out of the Oval Office. And so that was an example of his sort of impetuosity. And he brought that same style to his leadership. He didn't have the typical pyramid structure that Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower had. Rather, it was more of a flat flat system where he would poke his head into the office of somebody who was 3 layers down and ask them about certain things. He didn't want to be reined in by management structure. He was more or less his own chief of staff. And I think much to his peril. And then those initial days in the presidency, he makes some real mistakes. What was that private embarrassment because of the impetuousness and his inability to really prepare resulted in real public embarrassment with the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
It is interesting to sort of consider the degree to which style or management style, leadership style, whatever, I mean, that really does have real consequences in terms of how things happen. And the fact that he didn't have the attention span to stay in the Oval Office to meet the guy, it cost him. And that's just a small example, but the Bay of Pigs is not, of course.
Exactly.
I want to turn a little bit to one of the subjects that I think you just handle so well, and it sort of weaves throughout so much of this narrative, and that is the civil rights movement, which Kennedy, I think, I read it as you imply there's a real evolution in Kennedy over his time in terms of how he saw civil rights. I mean, early in the book, I made a note of a passage where you referenced his primary concern about civil rights was that it made us look bad abroad. To have riots and things in the street, it's like, oh, that's embarrassing. We can't have that. It wasn't a deep concern about how people are disenfranchised or how they've suffered. And yet, later, it appears that he was actually willing to risk losing the White House in '64 over the question of civil rights. It reminds me, when Harry Truman, when he recognizes Israel and then he desegregates in the summer of '48, and he's got to stand for election that fall, and people say, be careful, Mr. President, you might lose the election. And he said, well, I'd rather be right than be president. And JFK says a very similar thing, where he says, they said, well, be careful, this could blow up on you. He said, I don't care. And that's that's later in his administration. Could you walk us through a little bit of that, just that notion of how his attitude, even his relationship with Martin Luther King is interesting, because it never really, maybe it got warm, I don't know, but it felt like it was kind of a little like, I respect what you're doing, but we're not coming at this from the same direction.
It's pretty distant. You're right, and at times pretty tense. John F. Kennedy, as the Democratic presidential nominee in 1960, gets Martin Luther King released from a Southwest Georgia rural prison where it's potentially a fatal stay for King. He was jailed in Atlanta, and then he's shipped to this prison in rural Georgia, where he could potentially be killed by either inmates or guards, most of whom are white and most of whom are racist. And they know this. That's why the Georgian government ships him down there. But Kennedy calls Coretta Scott King and tells her that he will intervene in his release, and he makes good on that promise, calling the governor and asking him to let Martin Luther King go, which he does. Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., promises JFK a suitcase full of black votes for doing that, and he delivers. So originally Daddy King was for Richard Nixon, and he switches his allegiance, and the Democrats, most of the black community go for the Democratic ticket, which helps Kennedy. When Kennedy becomes president, as I mentioned, he's looking at his presidency through the lens of foreign policy. And he's trying to keep the civil rights movement at bay because it's an embarrassment. This is at a time when we are battling for hearts and minds across the globe to show that we are morally superior. It's hard to do that if you're being exposed for the apartheid in your country, the systemic racism and bigotry through a segregationist system. In fact, Bobby Kennedy says in the first year of the presidency, before John F. Kennedy is to go abroad for his first trip as president overseas, he says of the Freedom Riders who are trying to integrate bus systems through the South, if you continue to do this, the president's going to go to Europe with mud on his shoes. Right? It's not going to reflect well on him. And that's what they believe. So that happens in 61, the Freedom Rides. In 62, you get the very ugly integration of the Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and James Meredith would ultimately matriculate there, but there's a melee. It's a very ugly scene in Oxford, Mississippi, which plays out over the airwaves and in the newspapers. And then in 1963, we get the campaign in Birmingham. You all can conjure up those images of those gnashing dogs and those weaponized fire hoses holding back the soldiers of the movement in Birmingham. Martin Luther King goes to jail and writes his famous letter from the Birmingham jail after clergymen have urged him to be patient on civil rights. Don't be provocative. Things will come in time. And he writes this very eloquent letter saying, the time for patience is over. We need our rights observed now. And at the same time, you have George Wallace, the Bantam segregationist governor of Alabama, standing symbolically in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama, preventing its immigration. And finally, when John F. Kennedy sees Wallace demagoguing, he decides he's had enough. And he wants to go, this is what Kurt was alluding to earlier, he decides to go on air to sort of preempt George Wallace. Well, it's too late to write a complete speech, as Ted Sorensen, JFK's speechwriter, tells him. But Bobby Kennedy, who is his brother's, in many ways, conscience, says, go on anyway. Speak from your heart. So most of that legendary speech by John F. Kennedy on civil rights is extemporaneous. And he uses that address to the nation to elevate civil rights to a moral issue. Those are his words. And that becomes a turning point in the civil rights movement. He also proposes the Civil Rights Act of 1963, which would become the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson.
You know, the notion of civil rights as, the violence that's going on, the kind of how the country looks, what's the policy, how do we handle Wallace, how do we do these different things? There's sort of that level at a sort of higher political level. What I was intrigued about was you bring just a few instances in of a very personal way that he looked at other people. So toward the end, he's got Martin Luther King giving the I Have a Dream speech, and he's watching this from the White House on television, and he said, damn, he's good. I mean, he genuinely respected what the man could do. But earlier, when Sammy Davis Jr. showed up at the White House with his white wife, Kennedy said, get them out of here. I can't be photographed down there with them. I mean, and he heads up to the residence, as I recall, and tries to get Jackie to go down, I think, at some point. But it's just this like awkward, like, well, I'm with you, but I can't really be too close to that. So I think there's the sort of national struggle, but there's also this kind of personal thing going on with him that I'm not sure where he ended up in that trajectory in terms of how converted he became to the idea of equality and fairness and everything for everyone.
I'm not sure either. And I talked to Andrew Young about this. Andrew Young was one of the people that I interviewed for the book. And he said, well, John F. Kennedy didn't grow up around black people. He didn't know black people. He said he probably didn't know any black people until he became president. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, grew up around black people. Not when he was young, but when he became the head of the National Youth Administration during the Depression. He was working with African Americans all the time. He had taught Mexican American school children and saw through their eyes what bigotry and racial injustice looked like, as well as poverty. So it was a very different experience. I will also mention that while, as you point out rightfully, Kurt, Kennedy does something quite courageous in the spring of 1963 by making that speech and proposing the Civil Rights Act. He doesn't really try very hard to push it into law. It's mostly a symbolic gesture. Moreover, when the big six leaders of the civil rights groups, including Martin Luther King and John Lewis, meet with the president at the White House in June to talk about the March on Washington that they were planning for August of that same year, Kennedy tries to dissuade them from doing it. He's afraid it's going to backfire, there are going to be riots. And they tell him, we're going to go forward with it anyway, and that's when Kennedy watches it very trepidatiously, wondering what's going to happen, watches it at the White House, and of course it becomes an enormous success. So he invites the civil rights leaders, those same leaders, the big six, to the White House afterwards, and he goes up to Martin Luther King and he shakes his hand and says, I have a dream.
Wow. I got another question that I think we've got some microphones here for some audience participation in a moment, so be thinking of a question. I'm going to maybe sort of ask two questions in one here. I think that one of the things that we've all kind of, or at least I was sort of semi-aware of with Kennedy was his medical issues. I mean, he had a lot of pain from back injury, but I was surprised more than just pain pills. It seemed to me it was allergies, it was sleepers, it was ups and downs. I mean, all kinds of, Dr. Feelgood or whatever it was that was giving him stuff. And I just wonder how do you think, I know you quote Robert Dallek here, who says that it probably made things better because he wasn't distracted by the pain and he could relax and actually make decisions. But what do you make of that the person who's sort of, especially in a dangerous nuclear time, that he's, literally popping pills right and left?
I enumerate the medical regimen that he undergoes on any given day of the presidency, and it is staggering how many drugs it takes to get John F. Kennedy through the presidency because of the Addison's disease that he has, because of the chronic back issues that he has. It's disturbing in a sense. We have a right as the American people when we are electing a chief executive and commander-in-chief to know the health of our president.
Mm-hmm.
It's been disturbing in recent years that candidates and presidents haven't necessarily disclosed what their actual health is. They've hidden the facts. And we have every right to know what was happening. Kennedy, I think, was in denial about his Addison's disease. When there are rumors that he has it, and he said, I would come clean if I had it, but I don't. Well, yeah, he did. He thought he had a certain strain, but not really, and it's really rationalization. I think it's really important. It takes us a long time to sort out the legacies of our presidents. And it takes us a real long time to achieve any semblance of balance. I think the David McCullough biography of Truman is the first time I think we get a really accurate reflection of how Harry Truman stands up in history. But Lyndon Johnson's, it took far longer than it took for Truman. But what happened initially when John F. Kennedy was assassinated is you had the Camelot myth that came to light. And then you had this revisionism that went the other way. We saw the worst of John F. Kennedy. And finally, we're almost 60 years from the Kennedy presidency. And it allows us to look at his presidency on balance with a little bit more even-handedness, which is what I tried to achieve. But there are some blemishes on his character and on his record that you can't ignore, and one of them is the medical issues that he has.
Well, and given those medical issues, given his, you sort of get this picture of sort of a lack of energy in a guy who could just kind of get through the next day, and yet, and you do a great job chronicling this. He is a serial philanderer. It was amazing to me that, just the drive and the need that he had for that sort of extracurricular activity outside of his marriage. And it's interesting. I spoke a few years ago at the Kennedy Library with our mutual friend, Tom Putnam, who was director there at the time. And I said, Tom, how much did Jackie know? Did she know about this? And he said, oh, yes, she knew that he, had affairs and that he had, some outside interests. But she had no idea the scope and the scale of it. And you allude to it and spell it out, I think, as clearly as I've ever seen. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, because it's it is such an overwhelming part of who he was. It's not just that he had a couple of slips here and there. It was just such a part of his character and such a part of his identity even.
Womanizing was part of the Washington zeitgeist at the time. And Alex mentioned I've had the great honor of interviewing 7 presidents. One of them was Gerald Ford, who talked to me very candidly about what Washington was like at that time. And most of his colleagues were having some sort of extramarital affair or affairs. Mm-hmm. It was very, very common. Gerald Ford, I would add, did not. I'm quite confident. But in fact, one of the times I interviewed him was at the Truman Library. Not about this, but about something. But he also, John F. Kennedy learns at the feet of the master.
Yeah.
His father is a serial philanderer and very openly has affairs. And very openly lives with Gloria Swanson. I just want to say Gloria Steinem.
Yeah.
Not quite.
You heard it here first, folks. It's brand new history right here.
So that's why you should buy the book.
Yeah, exactly.
Bombshell.
Yes.
Gloria Swanson, who was a very famous actor at the time, they were openly living together in Hollywood. I think that womanizing was a way of keeping score in the very competitive, very testosterone-infused Kennedy household. But it's a little different for Kennedy. And so in some ways, you're looking at a Mad Men world in today's Me Too environment. And if you look at the zeitgeist, you might be able to rationalize it. I mean, just because it was so much a part of the culture of Washington. But you look at what he does, in particular with a White House intern named Mimi Beardsley, who loses her virginity as a 19-year-old intern to John F. Kennedy a week after she starts her internship at the White House. And he more or less treats her like a concubine. He even asks her to perform sex acts on one of his aides. It's impossible to look at that objectification and not know that it is a pronounced blemish on his character. You can't forgive something like that. On the other hand, you look at what Kennedy does in all of his pain in the White House, at the way he's able to perform his duties, at his clear thinking, and the flashes of greatness that he shows at key times. You have to look at that too. He's a very, very complicated character.
Is anybody, let's turn to the audience and see if we have any questions or comments, or anybody want to go ahead and say something?
I think we can hear you. We can hear you.
I think you need to go to the mic, I guess, because the people tuning in won't be able to hear if you don't get picked up in the...
I don't want to mess up my road here.
Yeah.
So much for being here. This has really, really been nice. But, I just recently reread Arthur Schlesinger's section about the Bay of Pigs, just because I was curious. I'd read it years ago. I thought Arthur Schlesinger made it sound like, according to Ike and Richard Nixon and the CIA, John F. Dulles, and then Richard Bissell, that the Bay of Pigs was like a slam dunk. And there's almost no way it's going to fail. Hey, Mr. President, how about an easy victory? But even Kennedy does become inquisitive, and he says, well, wait a minute, what's going to happen when these people that we trained, we gave them the guns, and we dropped them off on the beach, when that starts to go south, then what's going to happen? We just might need some planes to drop some bombs. And Kennedy flatly refused that in the Oval Office. And then they left the office, and this is his telling of it. When that rich kid finds out he's losing, he'll give us everything we want so that we can, beat up the Cubans. Well, he didn't do that, and he took serious egg on his face, as we all know. And I'm just curious. It sounded like what you shared there was slightly different than Arthur Schlesinger's account. I'm just wondering about that.
Well, if I did, it's misleading. I certainly took Schlesinger's account into consideration when I wrote the book. Arthur Schlesinger wrote the book 1,000 Days, which is a seminal history of the Johnson presidency, or of the Kennedy presidency. One of the things that there are two transition meetings between Eisenhower and Kennedy, and in the second, they talk about this plan that the CIA has put together around the incursion of Cuba by Cuban nationals and exiles, and they support the plan. And Kennedy wrings his hands about it in the first few months of his presidency, and finally does it. But it's pretty naive if you look at the plan. The plan certainly could have been tweaked. We know now that it was a colossal failure. We lost 110 Cuban exiles. Another several thousand were taken captive. It's probably the worst moment of the Kennedy presidency. That said, and this is just an aside, what do you think Kennedy's approval rating was after the Bay of Pigs failure? Throw out a couple numbers. 15%. What else? 60%. His approval rating was 83%. His disapproval rating was 5%. And it speaks volumes about John F. Kennedy, because we talked about that inauguration speech, that narrow victory, but that inauguration speech, we are captivated by this young leader. We are all in when it comes to him, and we know that the world is watching when he stubs his toe in Cuba around the Bay of Pigs. So we rally around our president at a time when, again, the Cold War is the dominant issue of the times. It says a lot about America and where we were almost 60 years ago, and unfortunately, it speaks poorly to where we are today. We knew the national good was around supporting this guy. We believed in him. And to Kennedy's credit, he takes the heat. In Harry Truman style, he says the buck stops with him. He says that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan, but at the end of the day, I'm the commander-in-chief, and this falls with me. And he resolves to do better, and he learns from it, and he does.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
My grandfather was in France during the Red Scare in the 1950s, and a lot of the black artists and musicians ended up over there, to get away from Congress. And he always told us stories about how they all came to eat soul food in his mess hall. So when they integrated the schools in 1960, my dad took us to Germany, and I was there for the Berlin Wall, Truman missile crisis, but de Gaulle kicked us out of France. And I never found out why it really happened until the 1980s, and it was over Vietnam. And I just like your comments on that.
I'm sorry for that situation. I think that reflected hopefully what was another world. Vietnam was a complicated issue for John F. Kennedy, just as it would be for Lyndon Johnson. And I think when John F. Kennedy was always trying to avert military conflict. He does so very successfully in the Cuban Missile Crisis, in those 13 harrowing days, which are perhaps the most dangerous moment in humankind. He learns to keep his very jingoistic military brass to the side, and he brings his close aides into council knowing that they won't leak, and he tries to figure out a way out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His military aides tell them that there should be airstrikes targeting the missile installations in Cuba. Instead, Kennedy advocates a naval blockade so that additional ships bringing in Soviet troops and arms can't come through. And that gives him time to resolve the conflict, which he does through a quid pro quo. What we thought of at the time, was a zero-sum victory on the part of the United States as Soviet ships ultimately retreated, was really an agreement. If you take your missiles out of Cuba, we'll take our missiles later out of Turkey, which was in the backyard of the Soviet Union, just as Cuba was in our backyard. So he resolves that peacefully. He decides not to engage militarily in Laos, which is potentially falling to the communists. He decides not to take a military stand when it comes to the Berlin Wall being constructed by the Soviet Union to divide East and West Berlin. And what was the hottest spot in the world, the most dangerous spot in the world, was Berlin at that time. But he realizes he has to take a stand in Vietnam. There's a lot of revisionism that says that John F. Kennedy would have had the foresight, had the wisdom, the prudence to have withdrawn troops over time. There is nothing in my research that suggests that that would be the case. In fact, on the contrary, I don't know how you could make the speech that John F. Kennedy made at his inauguration and be a proponent of the domino theory, which was the prevalent theory at the time that suggested that if one nation fell to communism, that others would fall in turn, and not take a stand after the USS Maddox was hit in the Tonkin Bay. So it's easy to look at Kennedy and what he might have done, but I don't think it would have been that easy for Kennedy to withdraw. But obviously what we now know is that Lyndon Johnson doubles down on Vietnam after the USS Maddox is hit. His military advisors say he has to escalate the conflict. He does. Just a few more thousand troops, Mr. President, will get this done. And and Vietnam becomes the same kind of military quagmire for Lyndon Johnson that the Bay of Pigs became for John F. Kennedy. Yes, sir.
Yeah, my question, thank you very much for your presentation today, and I look forward to reading the book. My question was basically the domino theory. Of course, that was Johnson's great flaw from that standpoint, but did Kennedy have a belief in that? And I guess you basically just answered my question. So.
You know, and it's very clear. In September of 1963, 2 months before he's assassinated, he does a series of interviews with the networks. Bear in mind, there were only 3 networks at the time. You all probably know them, ABC, CBS, and NBC. It was a very limited media landscape. So he does a couple of high-profile interviews, and he's asked about the domino theory, and he subscribes to it. He very much believes in the domino theory, which and says that it would be a deep mistake, those are his words, to withdraw troops from Vietnam. So that's what we know. We also know that Lyndon Johnson inherited the same cabinet that John F. Kennedy had when he died, and he had Robert McNamara as his Secretary of Defense, Dean Rusk exactly, George Bundy, the National Security Advisor, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State. They were giving Lyndon Johnson the same advice that they gave John F. Kennedy, and they never heard John F. Kennedy say that he would withdraw troops.
First off, thank you. It's great doing the Zooms. Wonderful to be back in person. Question: today in history, President Kennedy made the announcement we'd have a man on the moon by the end of the century, or by the end of the decade, excuse me. Could you comment on the impacts of the space program domestically and how that affected international relations?
Of course. So there's a quote that I use from Clement Attlee in the book. Clement Attlee was the successor to Winston Churchill in the prime ministership of Great Britain. And he says, words at great moments can be deeds. And while Kennedy doesn't do a lot, going back to our conversation, Kurt, his words can be deeds at really crucial times. And that certainly applies to the space race. The space race is essentially another facet of the Cold War. Sputnik goes up in 1957. We're afraid that the Soviet Union is gaining technological superiority, and it puts the fear of God in us. Lyndon Johnson, among others, says, "I will not go to sleep by the light of a communist moon." And that catalyzes the creation of NASA. But John F. Kennedy realizes that we should be advancing in our space program. This is at a time when our space program is a colossal failure. And he goes to Rice University, and he says, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And he talks about this as a uniquely American proposition, why this reflects the American spirit. And that's a pretty bold, he boldly says that we will get to the moon before the end of the decade. Now, we're behind the Soviet Union in the space race at this point. So that's a pretty bold proclamation. And it really reflects well on John F. Kennedy and his legacy, that he says to the American people and to the world that we're going to do this. And obviously we do it with the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. But the space race, which looks like this great, in retrospect, like Charles Lindbergh's flight across the Atlantic, is really about technical superiority. We did not want the Soviet Union to put weapons in space. So this whole space race is our competition with the Soviet Union, and of course we win partly because of the foresight and vision of John F. Kennedy. I know this guy.
You guys are probably wondering what this guy's going to ask, but Harry Truman had some interactions with Kennedy and had some pretty strong opinions about the Kennedy family. So I wondered if did you come across that, Mark, or Kurt, as the library director? You've probably seen some of the pictures and comments around the library.
Well, I know that when Kennedy first got into the race and was first, Truman just thought he was too young, just didn't have the experience, and he thought he was. I don't think he appreciated the Harvards sort of in the same way the way Johnson would have not appreciated them either. But my understanding is, and I'm going to let Mark correct me here, but my understanding is that once he got the nomination, and once it was clear that Kennedy was going to be the Democratic standard bearer, that Truman got on board and actually campaigned for him. I mean, went around and the fact that Kennedy invited Truman as his first, if I'm not mistaken, first Oval Office guest as president, right after the inauguration, invites him in. And according to what Mr. UPDEGROVE has chronicled here, on the way out of the White House, Truman was visibly emotional for having been invited back to the center of power, because obviously with Ike he hadn't had a lot of warm opportunities to come back for lunch. So I think
that's exactly right.
Yeah, so I think my understanding is that Truman's attitude about Kennedy, now he may not have changed his attitude in terms of the sort of socioeconomic kind of these privileged people. mentality that Harry Truman might have carried with him always, but he did, I think, come to respect Jack Kennedy.
That you said it exactly right. The way I see it, Kurt. In fact, one of the pictures in the book is of Kennedy and Truman emerging from the Oval Office in what was, as you suggested, his very first meeting. And Kennedy did that very pointedly. There was deep concern about Kennedy's Catholicism. Would he really report to the Vatican or to the American people? And what Harry Truman famously said, he was very wary of the Kennedy patriarch, Joe Kennedy, and said, it's not the Pope, it's the Pop.
Yeah. That's
So, and you're right, but what Kennedy does very wisely is he addresses the concerns of Truman on the air, and Truman and Eleanor Roosevelt, by the way, both had the same concerns. Yeah. He addresses those concerns on air very successfully, and then he comes down to the Truman Library afterwards, and he meets with Truman, and that really makes an impression on Harry Truman, who, as you said, Kurt, goes out and on the hustings for Kennedy, and when he invites him back, as you said, Truman was in the political wilderness during the Eisenhower years. There was great antipathy between the two of them. And he's visibly moved when there are tears in his eyes, and he says to an aide as they're leaving the White House, what about that, to invite an old farmer like me to the Oval Office on his very first day? It's a very sweet, tender moment.
Yeah, that is fantastic. Let's just wrap up here and talk a little bit about the legacy. I mean, what is John F. Kennedy's real achievement? And I think that, you mentioned the Camelot things, and I think, is it mostly a legacy, an achievement of style? And if so, maybe at that moment in time, maybe that's what we needed. Because when you look at the legislative accomplishments, it seems to me it's fairly thin. And when now he obviously earned his stripes and in a foreign policy way. I think he learned to stand up to the Russians. I mean, he certainly grew in the office, but he wasn't there long enough to really have a catalog of accomplishments like we would have seen had he lived, I'm sure. But what do you think in that substance versus style continuum, as we like to think of things? Where do you rate him?
When Kennedy it does his famous inauguration speech. Of course, he's beaten Richard Nixon for the presidency by that very narrow margin. And Kennedy, or rather Nixon, leaves the inauguration ceremonies, having now being the former vice president, and he drives home, parked at the Capitol and drives to his home in Northwest Washington. Along the way to his car, he bumps into Ted Sorensen. And Sorensen, of course, had a hand in the inauguration speech that Kennedy had delivered. And Nixon said, I wish I had said some of those things. And Sorensen says, what do you mean? You mean the part where he says, ask not? And Nixon says, no, the part where he said, I do solemnly swear. and that speaks that's any man and hopefully woman soon wants to make their own mark on the presidency. Kennedy made his mark very early with that inauguration speech. And 5 days after making that speech, he does a press conference, his first press conference. A third of all Americans tune in for this very prosaic press conference. And among other things, Kennedy asked the American people to stop sending letters and telegrams because they're flooding the White House communications office. So he makes his mark very early rhetorically. And I mentioned that quote, great words at great moments in history are deeds. There are those words that continue. They got us rallied around certain things which spoke to his popularity. Much of it is style. The title Incomparable Grace to some degree is superficial. It's that rhetorical splendor. It's his elegance, his eloquence, his good looks, his glamour. But that's important too. Most politicians understand the importance of image. Kennedy got that as much as anybody did. He called himself the antithesis of a politician. And by that he meant the sort of backslapping, baby-kissing, name-knowing politician that his maternal grandfather, Honey Fitz, the very colorful mayor of Boston, was. But he also knew he fit the times because he played well on television. And he knew this. And I think that helped the American image abroad at a very important time in the Cold War. Again, it got us believing in ourselves. But part of the Kennedy myth is what he would have done, as I mentioned, with Vietnam. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, Kennedy deals with these crises on feet of clay at times, showing flashes of greatness at others, but all he does indelibly. Honor and grace ultimately edging out recklessness and abandon, calling forth the best in all of us. That, I think, is the legacy of John F. Kennedy.
That's fantastic. You know, I wanted to just conclude with a comment here. Many of you, if you've been in our Truman family for some time and you've been to a lot of our programs, you know that you've met a lot of great presidential historians. In my mind, there are two people, David McCullough and Doris Kearns Goodwin, who are the what do you call him? The father of the Medicare,
The daddy.
the daddy, the daddy and the mommy of the presidential legacy and the presidential leadership business. Those two, and since that time, there is an entire generation of great writers, and you've heard them all here. You know, we've had Bill Brands, and we've had Doug Brinkley, and John Meacham, and Richard Norton Smith, and on and on and on. There's a great crop of writers today. But I want to submit to you that among that group, our friend Mark UPDEGROVE is the dean of that school. Wow. There is no one doing what he's doing today.
Very high praise.
For
Thank
sure. The word incomparable comes to mind, but nevertheless, there's no one doing what Mark is doing. His ability to carry a narrative, to really tell a story in a way that moves so quickly that you feel like you're part of an administration. You feel like you know the players and you're in the room when it happens. Oh, that line could catch on. Yeah. So anyway, with that, Mark, you've done us a great honor in being here. Thank you so much for including the Truman Library in your circuit as you've gone out to promote this incredible book. I wish you the best in book sales and in future writings. I can't wait to see the next book.
And thank you for that high praise for someone I deeply respect. And thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.